We hear a lot about fossils, don't we, in the press and on the news. It's often there as a comment about the latest fossil that's been discovered. So what I'd like to do this evening is just go through the idea of fossils and to try to understand and try to see what some of the scientists actually say about the fossil record. But the first thing I was going to do was to just look at a verse from the Scriptures. It's in Romans chapter 1 and verses 20 and 23. And here we read the Apostle Paul's words. He says, ever since the creation of the world, his, this is God's, invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. Well, that's quite logical, isn't it, in that sense? Those items in that passage in red there, it's been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. Well, if we believe everything's been made, then the fossil record's been made, hasn't it? So the fossil record should be showing God. It goes on there. So thou without excuse, for although they knew God, they did not honour him as God, or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, or birds, or animals, or reptiles. And if we're saying then that everything we see around us, and that's including the fossil record, shows us about God, then when men start talking about other things, they're using the records in a different way. The Bible's saying that these people are claiming to be wise, they're claiming ideas, but in fact they're foolish ideas, they're man's ideas, they're man-made ideas. Now, we may look at that and say, well, is that true or is it not true? So what I thought I'd do here, what we've got now is a number of quotes from scientists. Every single one of the quotes you're now going to see are scientists who believe in evolution. Because if I was to stand here and give you quotes of people who believe in creation, then you'd say, well, you're biased to what you're saying. It's not a fair analysis, because you can always find people who believe on your side of it and present your side of the picture. Well, let's see what the evolutionists say about the idea, because that's surely where we're going to get a fair analysis, we would say, to understand exactly what their view is of fossil record. So, this is a gentleman here, Sir Stanley, who's writing New Evolutionary in 1981, and he says here, it is doubtful whether, in the absence of fossils, the idea of evolution would represent anything more than an outrageous hypothesis. The fossil record, and only the fossil record, provides direct evidence of major sequential changes in the Earth's biota. So, if you want to see whether evolution is correct or not, the only evidence you can go to is the fossil record. There's nothing else out there, because in fact the fossil record is meant to give you a history, isn't it? So it provides evidence. You can build something upon something. You've got physical items and things you can find and prove a particular point of view, a particular theory. And he's saying there about fossil record is the only thing they've got. That's what you have to focus on, the fossil record. You can't say anything else. You can't look at genetics. You can't look at anything else. You just have the fossil record. That's all you can really prove our whole idea of evolution. And if not, it would be an outrageous hypothesis. That's what he's saying. So, let's start at the beginning, and here's what Charles Darwin said in The Origin of Species. He says, innumerable transitional forms must have existed, but why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the Earth? Why is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is a greatest objection which can be urged against my theory. So Darwin, when he worked out the original species and he gave the whole idea of evolution, how things develop and change, said his whole idea, his whole theory had one big fault line, and it was a major fault. He couldn't actually provide any evidence for it. He hadn't got the evidence in the geological records. When he went through them, he couldn't actually find the truth in it. There was no evidence to say that things gradually change, gradually alter over a period of time. And you might say, well, why did he present the theory and had no evidence for it? Well, he believed the evidence would be found. He believed it was there, and it's just the fact that scientists had not looked at a certain number of areas and the geological formations in enough detail, and the evidence would eventually come out. So it was a theory, which would eventually prove true. That was his thoughts on the idea. So let's look at the geological timelines. I suppose we used to see graphs like that, aren't we, in many books and tables, and it's showing there the gradual development of creatures over a period of time, getting more and more complex than the simplistic first species and chordates at the bottom. Around about 500, 600 million years ago, the Cambrian period here, and it slowly develops over a period of time, and eventually at the top there is man. And we've seen those in textbooks if you've been in school and things like that. That's what we see, that kind of structure of how things developed and how the geological formations should show that development. That's the impression we're given, isn't it? That's what we see. And I'd just like to focus on this beginning point here, the Cambrian period, because this is what this gentleman says about it. Richard Dawkins, the blind watchmaker. Now, I know he's definitely an atheist. He does not believe in God anyway. What does he write? He says, for example, the Cambrian strata of rocks, vintage around 600 million years, are the oldest ones in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups. And we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution. The very first time they appeared, it's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Did he ever tell us that? Did evolutionists tell us that? Up to this point, our textbooks tell us that. But in fact, that very first moment in time when a creature appears, it's already developed. It's already there in an advanced state of evolution. There's no history going back. And look at the comments he makes, an interesting after that. He goes, needless to say, this appearing of southern planting has delighted creationists. It's bizarre, isn't it, really? Here's a man who we know believes in evolution and saying that the actual evidence he's got doesn't actually prove it. Interesting. Well, here's another gentleman here. This is a very famous evolutionist, a chap called Stephen Gould. He was right. He said, the Cambrian explosion occurred in a geological moment, and we have reason to think that all major anatomical designs, he uses the word designs there, which you shouldn't do, of course, if being an evolutionist, may have made their evolutionary appearance at that time. So here's another gentleman who believes in evolution saying, that Cambrian explosion, he calls it there, everything suddenly appeared. It was just there. There's no history. There's no slow development from a simple creature to a gradually more complex. Every single one of them appeared at that moment in time, in that period. And he goes on to say, contrary to Darwin's expectation that new data would reveal gradualistic continuity with slow and steady expansion, all major discoveries of the past century have only heightened the massiveness and geological abruptness of this formative event. That's quite interesting, isn't it? So he's saying that, they all knew what Darwin thought would happen. Gradually, the evidence came to light, which showed that creatures developed over a long period of time. He's saying, since then, which is about 100 years afterwards, after Darwin, all the evidence that they found actually show the opposite. Actually show that Darwin's theory has no basis on which to stand. There is no slow development. Everything was just there at the moment in time. Here's another gentleman writing 1993. He says, the remarkably complex forms of animals we see today suddenly appeared. This moment, right at the start of the Earth's Cambrian period, marks the evolutionary explosion that filled the seas with the Earth's first complex creatures. This is Genesis material, gushed one researcher, demonstrates that the large animal phyla of today were present already in the Earth's Cambrian and that they were as distinct from each other as they are today. Menagerie of clam cousins, sponges, segmented worms, and other invertebrates that would seem vaguely familiar to any scuba diver. So basically, if you went into the sea today, you would see the same creatures as are in the rock strata of the Cambrian period, 600 million years ago, according to them. That's what you'd see. There'd be no difference, no change, no alteration, no gradual development, no smaller number of creatures, but over years of gradual development, a bigger number of creatures. All the creatures were there. Everything was there at that period. Now, so what we're saying about this period, Cambrian period, 600 million years ago. Now we can look at the 600 million years, and there's whole issues around dating. So you can exclude the fact 600 million years ago as far as I'm concerned, but there are issues around that. We haven't got time to do that this evening. But basically, that Cambrian strata of rocks where the evolutionists believe should start the process of evolution, what does it actually tell us when these scientists actually spoke in their words? It tells us it was complex right from the beginning. It was planted, sudden appearance, no evolutionary history, so no development, just suddenly there. All major anatomical designs. So what you see around us today, in the world today, all those animals or those species were there at that moment in time, and there was no new phyla, so no changes. Nothing new was developed since that period of time. And that's not what they teach, is it? But that's what they're telling us. That's what Dawkins has told us. That's what Darwin has told us in other evolution. That's what they're speaking, isn't it? They're telling us that's the situation, that's the truth of the story. Now that evolutionary tree is what we see often in our textbooks if you're in school, and it shows that gradual development. This amoeba creature here, and it goes through fishes on one side and reptiles, and then horses and mammals, and eventually end up in man. Other routes go on to insects, don't they, after going through crustaceans, and trees slowly develop from ferns into major trees and other things. That's what we see, isn't it? In our books. Well, here's Stephen Gould again. And he's going back and he's telling us this: the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. So what you see there in that picture is just guesswork. There is no evidence behind that at all. Here's another gentleman saying, the evolution of the earth, here they're speaking, say, we have arranged the groups in a traditional way, with the simplest forms first, and progressively more complex groups following. This particular arrangement is arbitrary, and depends on what definition of complexity you wish to choose. Things are alike because they are related, and the less they look alike, the further removed they are from their common ancestor. So when you see that picture, well, actually, it should look like that. So they haven't actually got any history to it at all. And what's interesting, when you start looking at these things here, because the more scientists have looked into it, more complex the most simplest fishes are. More complex the most simplest insects are. And so the argument is, well, actually, you could go crossways. You can go any way you like on this diagram, if you actually want to use complexity as an argument. You said, we look at something, use our eyes and think, well, that looks more complex. That simple little rodent looks more complex than a great big elephant. Therefore, the rodent must have come first, and the elephant ended up at the end of the day. There's no evidence of that, and in fact, that rodent's probably just as complex as the elephant is on certain levels. It just happens not to be as big as an elephant. So that's what they're saying. The complexity goes on different planets. And what's interesting is that I know that in a recent television program, I think David Attenborough, he was explaining this, and he used a chart like that, evolutionary tree chart like that. And he got complaints from scientists saying you're totally misleading people because you're arguing that complexity leads upwards when complexity is just a detail of crossways, and you shouldn't present that kind of stuff. It's not true. It undermines your whole argument you're being presented with there. You're not giving people a true picture. But I'm just going to take one example here, and it's the evolution of a whale. And this is just quite interesting because certain scientists will look at the evolution of certain creatures. And there's one particular scientist who dealt with the evolution of a whale. And he made a big announcement, and it was about discovery of this species here, Rhodus hetus. So what did he actually say at the time he discovered it? This is 1994, and it's a gentleman called Dr. Philip Greenwich. And it says here, the new species, Rhodus hetus was the earliest known transitional whale with an anatomy adapted for swimming like a whale. It had a more streamlined body and a fully flexible rear spinal column, which should have produced a motion for a powerful beat of a horizontal tail fluke that propels modern whales. Well, if you were to look in the oceans now and you looked at various creatures, what he's saying is basically that fishes swim like that, but whales, dolphins, they swim like that. There's a totally different anatomical design to get a whale to swim like that. What he's saying is, at the time, 1994, that this species, Rhodohetus, he found, was one of the missing links in the whale evolution. And he discovered this particular link because he'd understood that the tail fluke went up and down like that. And it swung like that. So this linked into the whole argument about what he's presenting here. Well, it's interesting because in 2001, this is what he says. Ambercetus may be on a slight whale sideline. Very strange as its eyes are on top of its head and unusually large for an early whale. Maybe it is not in the main evolutionary training. So that's just about the previous one, the previous one he discovered. Then he says Rhodohetus, which is one he's now just discovered, and said about it in 1994. He says, Rhodohetus, we don't have the tail in Rhodohetus. But wait a second, didn't you say in 1994 you had the tail? And that's what linked it in. He says, we don't have it, so we don't know for sure. So I speculated that it might have a fluke. I now doubt whether Rhodohetus would have had a fluke tail. Since then we have found the forelimbs, etc., and understand it does not have the kind of arms that can be spread out like flippers on a whale. But in 1994 he convinced the world, what he said was he had found that missing link. He had found that Rhodohetus there, he had found it. And what's going on here? What's happening? What's this man doing? Well, what you have to remember is that when scientists do this work, what they're trying to do is they're trying to base an argument which is going to get them publicity, going to get them opportunities to go and speak at various areas around the world, at various conferences. And this is this man's living. But by saying he's found this species of animal, or this particular missing link, he gets himself prestigious positions and jobs to do and money to come into his particular area of scientific study. He's got a vested interest in doing this. Irrespective of the fact that 7 years later he actually says it was wrong, when he wasn't actually telling people the correct stuff. And in fact, what he found out when he discussed it was he found bones in different areas. So these bones he discovered, which he put together, weren't actually the same bones from the same species in the same place. And he'd made it seem as if he found this missing link. So when you actually look at it, what he actually said, well, he started off here, we have this creature, this Pakicetus. Well, if you go around and look at see what people think the first species was that eventually happened to a whale, some will say it was a bear, some will say it's some kind of tiger creature, some will say it's some kind of hyena creature that went back into the sea. No one really has a clue what it might have been. And then our friend has said, well, he knows that one's not in the right line now, because its eyes are all wrong. That's what he said. He knows that one's not in the right line, Rhodohetus, because he said that actually didn't have a fluke tail at all. So what you basically got is you've got an animal living on the ground, on the earth, and you've got one that's in the sea that's like a whale. You've got nothing in between. So he's undermined all his evidence. He has no evidence at all. So he's got no evolutionary track of a whale at all. He has no idea. And so there's no evidence there in the fossil record of that particular track of a whale. So let's carry on. This is another chap talking here. So the evidence we find in the geological records is not nearly as compatible with Darwin's natural selection as we'd like it to be. So here's an evolution saying, unfortunately, what I'm getting is, I haven't got enough information here. It's not, I'd love it to be better than it is, but it's not. And he goes on, Darwin was completely aware of this. He was embarrassed by the fossil record because it didn't look the way he predicted it would. Well, we are now 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of a fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. By this I mean that some of the classic cases of Darwinal change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. So 120 years after Darwin, he's saying the evidence we've got is even less now for Darwin's theory than it was when Darwin was looking at it. All the more information unearthed actually shows us nothing more. Actually makes the situation even worse. And what we thought we had evidence like this, in fact, we know that's incorrect. We know it's incorrect. That's the evolution of the horse in North America, which I knew in my textbooks. I used to look at that in my textbooks when I was learning about it at school, at biology. We know it's wrong. We know it's incorrect. And it's interesting because here is some words from Colin Patterson, who was the senior paleontologist at the British Museum, where that particular exhibit was. He says, there have been an awful lot of stories, some more imaginative than others, about what the nature of that history of life really is. The most famous example, still exhibit downstairs, is the exhibit of a horse on horse evolution prepared perhaps 50 years ago. This has been presented as a literal truth in textbook after textbook. Now, I think that is lamentable, particularly when the people who propose those kinds of stories may themselves be aware of the speculative nature of some of that stuff. He's in charge of the British Museum of Natural History. He believes in evolution, and he's saying the evidence we're providing is false. It's incorrect. We are misleading people, many deliberately. It is totally speculative, and it's not indicated, but it is speculative. It's a theory. It is evidence, it provides evidence that it is a truth, and it's not the truth. That's what they're telling you. It's not the truth. And he goes on to say, you should say at least, or you say I should at least show a photo of a fossil from which each type was derived. I will lay it in the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. It is easy enough to make up stories of how one form gave rise to another, but such stories are not part of science, for there is no way of putting them to the test. I don't think we shall ever have any access to any form of tree which we can call factual. So there's a gentleman telling us the truth, basically. He's presenting it, he believes in evolution, but in fact he says it is founded on absolutely no evidence whatsoever. It's fascinating, isn't it? How honest they are in amongst themselves, talking about the evidence they provide as being the truth. He's back to Stephen Gould again. What's he say? Every paleontologist knows that most species don't change. That's bothersome, brings terrible distress. They may get a little bigger or bumpier, but they remain the same species, and that's not due to imperfection and gaps but status. And yet this remarkable status has generally been ignored as no data. If they don't change, it's not evolution, so you don't talk about it. And he's laid outline pretty obviously there, isn't he, exactly what his views are. They have no data. They have nothing to prove the whole theory on. There's no evidence out there. It is just a theory. And he even said it's bothersome, isn't it? It causes him great distress. He's got no evidence to support what he believes in. Fascinating, isn't it? The record now reveals that species typically survive for 100,000 generations or even 1 million or more without evolving very much. We seem forced to conclude that most evolution takes place rapidly, a punctuational model of evolution. The point here is that if a transition was typically rapid and the population small and localised, fossil evidence of the event would never be found. Isn't that interesting? So their conclusion is, they have no evidence to show that evolution has occurred over a long period of time. There's no gradual change. All the evidence shows us that things just suddenly appear. So what do we say to that then? Well, the argument now put forward is that evolution occurred so fast you missed it. That's what he's basically saying. It occurred so fast that you missed it. So there's never going to be any evidence. We're never going to provide you the detail behind the theory because there's no evidence out there. So you have to just accept it on faith that it occurred. Interesting, isn't it? Fascinating. What's interesting about this is that many of these comments that I'm using here were used by creationists in discussions with evolutionists. And they came up and said, well, you know what Mr. Stanley says, you know what Stephen Gould says. And these people eventually told, please do not make these quotes and comments like this, which undermine the very fact of evolution. Please stop doing it because you're undermining it. And evolutionists now will not have discussions with creationists because of the evidence that's residing in this situation. They do not want to have sit-down discussions or detailed discussions with people who believe in creation because they have no evidence to support their particular argument. These some words that were recent from a book review. It says, we cannot identify ancestors or missing links, and we cannot devise testable theories to explain how particular episodes of evolution came about. He is adamant that all the popular stories about how the first amphibians conquered the dry land, how birds developed wings and feathers for flying, how the dinosaurs went extinct, and how humans evolved from apes are just products of our imagination, driven by prejudice and preconceptions. You see, the thing is, there's no money, there's no prestigious position created when you tell people, scientists speak, and say creation is actually true. No one pays you for doing that. No one's going to give you your salary. No one's going to let you do studies into evolution if you're saying actually evolution isn't there. It's actually creation, it's about God. That's a major issue here. If you, as a scientist, work in areas and fields like this, if you are teaching that creation, everything's pointed towards creation, then there's no money, your livelihood's gone, because there's nothing you can work on anymore. And you won't get any support from anyone if you have that argument, if you have that viewpoint. So let's do our final verse here from the scriptures. It's so simple, isn't it, what God says. So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves with which the waters swam, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. That's what the actual fossil record shows us. Ignoring the dates on there, when anything came into being, it just appeared, just like that. There is no evidence of any change that occurred over millions of years, or thousands of years, or even 10 years. Nothing happens. Things do not change. Because that's what God said in the beginning. And God said that the evidence is there all around us. The fossil record provides very evidence that God had existed, that things just were there. They were created by God instantaneously, just like that. That's what the fossil record actually teaches us. And yet men, in their foolishness, come up with ideas. And that's what God said, it's just foolish ideas. There's no grounding to them, there's no base in them. You can see out there, just go into fossil record, and that proves that I existed, I created everything. That's what it actually proves, not man's theories. Thank you.